Kirsten Gillibrand dropped out of the presidential race this week, and I think she has the fairly unglamorous distinction of having run the most embarrassing campaign of anybody thus far in the cycle. And not just that the campaign itself was embarrassing, which it was, but that her failure is the most dramatic and obvious of pretty much anybody who's run at this point. Kirsten Gillibrand was well suited or well positioned to potentially run a fairly formidable campaign. She occupies the Senate seat in New York that people such as Hillary Clinton previously occupied. You could even go back to Robert F. Kennedy, who had that same seat. I mean, being a senator from New York, and she's been there for 10 years, gives you access to a huge number of networks, whether it's donors or operatives or whatever, that on paper should serve as a fairly strong starting point for a campaign. And yet she had to drop out in somewhat humiliating fashion this week. This was after she, Gillibrand, spent the most money of any presidential candidate for the Democrats, other than Tom Steyer, who's this obscene billionaire, on Facebook ads in the past 90 days. And the point of those Facebook ads was to essentially beg for $1 donations so that she could clear the 130,000 contributor threshold to make it into the next debates, and Gillibrand never cleared that threshold. So that really compounds the embarrassment. But there's the bigger issue of that she basically based on this conceit that if you appeal enough to the hyper woke sensibilities of the professional class in the Democratic Party, that's going to guide you to victory. I think anybody who has any sense whatsoever probably could have counseled her that that was a ridiculous approach, and she went with it nonetheless, to the point that now she is explaining away her failure as such to the New York Times in an exit interview. She said, quote, "I don't know," in terms of why her campaign failed. She said, "My campaign may well have been ahead of its time." Or perhaps the voters of this time saw your campaign, saw you how you were conducting it, saw which issues you were bringing to the forefront, and saw your worldview as maybe a tad phony. That could be an alternate explanation rather than some amorphous attribution of blame to these external forces who, for some reason, were insufficiently hospitable to Gillibrand. And her entire idea was running like a female-focused campaign where she highlighted her femininity. And there's nothing wrong inherently with highlighting one's femininity, but she did it in this kind of cloying and shallow way that came across just as a pandering tactic or a marketing scheme. If you went and looked at how her supporters conducted themselves, they would always be wearing these kind of like hot pink pieces of attire, and she herself wore that kind of attire, and I don't find anything wrong with the color pink. I wear it on occasion, but it sort of goes to the superficiality of her campaign approach, that she thought that appealing to this very superficial notion of femininity was somehow going to benefit her, and she can't use the argument that somehow the voters are not ready for a female standard bearer. I mean, Elizabeth Warren is either in second or third place, depending on depending on the day of the poll. Kamala Harris, for whatever her faults, is seen as a somewhat viable contender. So perhaps the failure is is traceable back to Gillibrand's uniquely unconvincing feminist construction that she adopted for herself. And even plenty of female voters who are otherwise inclined toward feminism had no affinity for her campaign. So rather than suggesting that there was something just about the times that didn't lend itself to success for her, maybe she should look a little more inward, because other female candidates are doing perfectly well, and she has crashed and burned in a humiliating way. And you almost got the sense that at times her entire campaign philosophy was based on like blog posts run by, overeducated millennial consultant types. And, that was basically her MO. And is it any wonder that that sensibility didn't take hold in the wider electorate, even among people who are nominally kind of in line with the sensibility that you're trying to project? Apparently, even those voters who might prioritize feminism or having a feminist candidate don't want to be condescended to. And in the case of Warren, whatever criticism you might have of her, she's a competent individual. She happens to be a woman, and maybe that is more of a feminist statement unto itself than anything that Kirsten Gillibrand could conjure up as a result of one of her, I'm sure, very tedious meetings with like graduates from Oberlin and Bard and such. The superficiality of her worldview, I think, is also evident in the fact that she pretty consciously cultivated the most nominally anti-Trump voting record of any candidate, meaning that she voted against pretty much every Trump appointment, any legislation that could be seen as supported by Trump. Basically, there are these metrics that gauge how senators and members of Congress vote in accordance or not with Trump. Now, the metrics themselves are a little bit flawed, but if you go by those metrics, she was the most anti-Trump candidate running, but her anti-Trumpism was never really coupled with a compelling systemic critique of the system which gave rise to Trump, and I think that's why people didn't take it all that seriously. It just, again, seemed like she was trying to check her boxes and appeal to the resistance crowd without doing the real work to create a political image that suggested something deeper than just this kind of reactive aversion to Trump, which, you can probably get some way. You can probably make some headway with that approach, but evidently not enough in her case to really make any inroads. So, rather than blaming the times or blaming these kind of amorphous, ill-defined forces, which for some reason didn't lend itself to success, maybe Gillibrand should blame herself. I mean, the most viral moments that she had, to the extent that she had any, were just always cringe-inducing, such as going to Iowa and lecturing Iowa voters about white privilege. I mean, is that really what rural Iowan voters want to hear? I mean, there's almost a way that you could discuss that topic in a compelling and interesting manner, but with Gillibrand, it just came across as incredibly awkward and almost uncomfortable. And should you be striving to make everybody comfortable in every situation if you're a politician? No, not necessarily, but for Gillibrand, it didn't seem to amount to anything. It was just her way of kind of, to use the cliche, virtue signaling to a certain cohort within the Democratic primary electorate that obviously wasn't large enough in the first place to give her any real support. And then, I think one of her saddest moments is when she obviously had this premeditated attack against Joe Biden in the second debate in Detroit. I guess she saw how well that worked ostensibly. It didn't really, but how well it was portrayed as having worked for Kamala Harris, and wanted to come up with her own viral Biden moment. And she managed to blatantly mischaracterize an op-ed that Joe Biden had written from decades earlier about women working outside the household and such. And that's a spectacularly epic fail, because there is no shortage of material from Biden's history that you could legitimately attack him on, and Gillibrand managed to even screw that up, which was probably the last stake in the heart of her campaign. You know, it's funny because most failed candidates, when they run for president, at least manage to leverage their influence networks and donors and such into a burnishment of their career prospects in one way or another, whether it's further elected office or some other pursuit. And Gillibrand managed, I think, to just do the exact opposite, in that she looks worse now than she did when she started. And that really, I think, ought to cause her to really evaluate the core precepts of her reason for running, which obviously were utterly rejected by the electorate. So there you have it. I wrote this up at The Spectator today, which I will link to in the description box. Read the piece, I humbly ask, and I'll talk to you later.